The room goes silent the moment Gerald Whitfield laughs out loud, pointing at the barefoot boy standing near the old piano. Everyone in the hall turns to look. Mothers clutch their children closer. A few fathers chuckle nervously, unsure if they are allowed to laugh along with the man in charge. The boy does not move. He stands there, holding a folded piece of paper in his hand, his shoes worn through at the toes, his shirt too big for his thin shoulders. "You want to audition on that piano?" Gerald says, waving his hand toward the instrument like it is a joke itself. "In those clothes, with those hands." A woman near the front gasps quietly. Someone else lowers their phone, embarrassed to be recording. Gerald Whitfield is the director of Ashcombe Music Academy, a place known across the city for turning ordinary children into concert performers. He built his reputation on being blunt, unafraid to tell parents their children have no talent, unafraid to end an audition after 10 seconds. Today, the Academy is holding open auditions for its yearly scholarship, the only way a child without money can join. 200 families showed up. Only one scholarship spot is open. The boy's name is Elias. He is 12 years old. He walked 3 miles to get here, alongside his grandmother, Margaret, who waits near the back wall, her hands folded tightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on her grandson. Gerald looks at the sign-up sheet in his hand, then back at Elias. "Piano," he reads aloud, mockingly. "Self-taught." A ripple of laughter moves through the front rows. Elias keeps his eyes forward. "Let me guess," Gerald continues, enjoying the attention now, playing to the crowd like a comedian who found his rhythm. "You learned from videos, from a phone, from your imagination maybe." "Yes, sir," Elias answers, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the back of the room. Gerald's smile widens, but there is no warmth in it. He turns to the judges seated beside him, 3 teachers from the academy, and to the parents watching, and he raises his voice so that every single person can hear him clearly. "If this boy plays one decent note on that piano," he says, "I will kneel down right here, on this floor, in front of everyone." The room erupts. Some parents laugh outright. Others whisper to each other, shaking their heads at the cruelty of it, but no one stops him. A teenage boy in the 3rd row lifts his phone and starts recording, grinning at his friend beside him. "This is going to be good," he mouths. Margaret's hands tighten around each other at the back of the room. She does not laugh. She does not look away. She watches her grandson's back, straight and unmoving, and she remembers every night she found him at the small keyboard app on her old phone, headphones pressed to his ears so he would not wake her, his fingers moving silently across the glass screen because there was no real piano in their house. Margaret had raised Elias alone since her daughter passed away 2 years earlier. She cleaned houses across the city, 6 days a week, and every evening she came home to find him sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at that small screen, practicing scales he had learned from free videos at the public library. She never once told him to stop, even when her own hands ached too much to hold a broom the next morning, because it was the only thing that seemed to bring him back to himself after the funeral. This morning, before the sun had fully risen, Elias woke her gently and asked if they could walk to the academy together. They did not have money for a bus fare that day, not after the rent was paid, so they walked the full 3 miles, Margaret in her work shoes, Elias in the sneakers with the split seams he refused to complain about. Neither of them said much along the way. There was nothing that needed saying. They both knew what today meant. Now, standing at the back of a crowded hall, watching a man in an expensive suit mock her grandson in front of 200 strangers, Margaret feels something tighten in her chest, somewhere between anger and fear, but she stays silent, because she knows Elias would not want her to make a scene on his behalf. He has never wanted anyone to fight his battles for him. Near the front, one of the mothers leans toward her husband and whispers something behind her hand, glancing at Elias's shoes. Her husband chuckles quietly. A group of younger students, dressed in clean, pressed clothes clearly bought just for today, exchange smirks with each other, already certain of how this is going to end. This is the kind of room Elias has walked into before, more times than he can count. Rooms full of people who decide what he is worth before he has said a single word. He does not let it show on his face. Elias walks toward the piano bench. The room follows him with their eyes. Gerald crosses his arms, still smiling, already certain of how this will end. The judges beside him exchange glances. One of them, a woman named Clara, looks uncomfortable, but she says nothing. Each step Elias takes across the polished floor feels longer than it should. The whispers do not stop, but they grow quieter, replaced by the soft rustle of 200 people shifting in their seats to get a better view. Somewhere behind him, a phone camera clicks. Somewhere else, a child asks her mother in a loud whisper why the boy looks so calm, and her mother shushes her without answering. Elias has learned, over the last 2 years, how to walk into rooms like this without letting his face show what is happening inside him. It is a skill he never wanted to learn, but grief and hardship have a way of teaching lessons no child should need. He keeps his eyes forward, fixed on the piano, the one steady thing in a room full of judgment. Elias sits down. The bench creaks under him. The piano itself is old, one of the Academy's practice instruments, missing paint along its edges, but every key still works. He places the folded paper he has been carrying on the small shelf above the keys, then decides against it, and slides it into his pocket instead. He does not need it. He knows every note by heart. He closes his eyes for just a moment. In that moment, the noise of the room seems to fade for him, the whispers, the phone cameras, the laughter still lingering in the air. He thinks of his mother, of the sound of rain against their old window, of the last song she used to hum while she cooked, before she got sick, before the hospital, before the silence that followed her. He opens his eyes. His fingers touch the keys. The first note is soft, almost hesitant, but it is clean, perfectly in tune, perfectly placed. The second note follows it, then a third, and within seconds the laughter in the room begins to die down, not because anyone asked it to, but because something in the sound demands attention. Gerald's smile falters, just slightly, but he keeps his arms crossed, keeps his chin lifted, telling himself this is beginner's luck, a lucky opening phrase that will fall apart any second now. But it does not fall apart. Elias's hands move with a confidence that does not match his age, or his clothes, or anything the room expected from him. Tondane. The melody grows, rising and falling with a kind of sadness that makes several people in the audience go completely still. A mother in the second row presses her hand to her chest. An old man near the door removes his hat, though no one told him to. The piece is not one anyone in the room recognizes. That is because it does not exist anywhere except inside Elias's memory. He wrote it himself, note by note, over 2 years, in the quiet hours after his mother passed away, teaching himself the shape of grief through sound, because he did not have the words for it any other way. Clara, the judge sitting closest to Gerald, leans forward in her seat, her pen forgotten in her hand. The other 2 judges do the same, their earlier boredom replaced completely by something closer to disbelief. Gerald Whitfield does not move. His arms are still crossed, but his jaw has tightened, and his eyes, once full of mockery, now carry the first traces of doubt. The teenage boy who was recording for a joke lowers his phone slowly, his grin long gone, replaced by something like awe. Beside him, his friend whispers, "Is he for real right now?" But neither of them laughs. At the back of the room, Margaret does not move either. Though her eyes have filled with tears she refuses to let fall in public. She has heard this song before, late at night, through thin apartment walls, played on a cracked phone screen, with the volume turned all the way down. She never imagined she would hear it filled out fully, played on a real instrument, in front of 200 strangers. The melody keeps rising, climbing towards something that feels almost too big for the small, tired piano to hold, and every single person in that hall leans forward just slightly, waiting to see where the sound will take them next. The sound builds into something fierce now, fast runs of notes chasing each other up and down the keyboard. Elias's whole body moving with the rhythm, his elbows lifting slightly with each strike, his foot pressing the worn pedal at exactly the right moments even though no one ever showed him how. This is the part of the piece he wrote during the hardest month, the month after the hospital, when the silence in their small apartment felt louder than any sound he had ever heard. He poured that silence into speed, into urgency, into a storm of notes that refuses to let the listener look away. Clara, the judge nearest to Gerald, has stopped pretending to take notes entirely. Her pen sits forgotten on her lap while her eyes stay fixed on the boy's hands, watching them move faster than she has seen in students who have trained for a decade. Beside her, the other 2 judges lean toward each other and exchange a glance that says everything neither of them is willing to say out loud yet. Gerald Whitfield stands rooted to the same spot, his earlier confidence completely drained from his face. He watches the boy's hands the way a man watches something he cannot explain, something that breaks every assumption he walked into the room with. He built his entire career on being able to tell, within seconds, whether a child had real talent. He has never once been wrong. He is being proven wrong right now, in front of everyone. The storm of notes begins to ease, the fast section giving way to something slower again, something that sounds almost like a question being asked and then answered. This is the section Elias added only recently, the section that came after he finally stopped being angry and started simply missing her instead. The anger fades from the music the same way it had slowly faded from him, replaced by something gentler, something closer to acceptance. In the audience, an elderly man near the door wipes his eyes with the back of his hand, not caring who sees him do it. A young girl in the second row tugs her mother's sleeve and whispers that she wants to learn piano too, right now, tonight. Her mother nods without looking away from the stage, too moved to answer properly. Margaret, at the back of the room, finally lets one tear fall. She does not wipe it away. She has spent 2 years holding herself together, for her grandson's sake, working long hours, stretching every dollar, telling him that things would get better even on nights when she was not sure that was true. Hearing him play this piece, fully, in front of strangers, feels like watching every quiet sacrifice finally arrive somewhere. The final passage begins. It is soft, deliberate, each note given space to breathe before the next one arrives. Elias's shoulders relax slightly for the first time since he sat down. His eyes, still closed, seem to be somewhere far away from this hall, somewhere only he and his mother ever visited together. The last chord rings out and fades slowly into silence. For a moment nobody moves, nobody breathes. The hall holds its breath the way it does after lightning, waiting for the sound that always follows. Then the applause breaks out, sudden and overwhelming, rising from every corner of the room at once. People are on their feet before they realize they have stood up. The teenage boy who filmed the whole thing as a joke is clapping so hard his hands sting, his earlier smirk completely gone, replaced by something like disbelief mixed with respect. Elias opens his eyes slowly. He looks almost surprised to find himself back in the crowded hall, surrounded by strangers on their feet, applauding him. He glances toward the back of the room and finds Margaret immediately, as if he always knew exactly where she was standing. She presses her hand to her heart and nods at him, unable to speak even if she tried. But the loudest silence in the room does not belong to the audience. It belongs to Gerald Whitfield, who stands frozen at the front, his own words from minutes earlier now echoing back at him louder than any applause. "If this boy plays one decent note, I will kneel down right here." He said it clearly. He said it in front of 200 witnesses. He said it while at least a dozen phones were already recording, capturing every syllable for anyone who wanted proof later. The applause slowly begins to quiet, and as it does, people start turning their attention away from the piano and toward Gerald instead, waiting, the way a crowd waits before a magic trick is revealed. Someone near the front, a father holding his phone steady, calls out loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "Well," the man says, not unkindly, but firmly, "a promise is a promise." A ripple of agreement moves through the crowd. A few people laugh, but it is a different kind of laughter now, no longer cruel, no longer aimed at the boy at the piano. It is aimed squarely at the man who mocked him. Near the front row, a woman named Nora, mother of one of the other auditioning children, leans toward her son and speaks quietly, though her voice carries just far enough to be heard by those nearby. "Remember this," she tells him. "Remember what it costs to judge someone before you know them." Her son nods slowly, his own earlier smirk replaced with something closer to embarrassment, remembering how he had laughed along with the crowd only minutes before. A group of teenagers near the side wall, the same ones who exchanged smug looks when Elias first signed his name on the audition sheet, now stand quietly with their phones lowered, unsure of where to look. One of them mutters an apology under his breath, though it is unclear whether he is apologizing to Elias, to himself, or simply to the discomfort now sitting heavy in his chest. Gerald's face flushes red. He looks toward the 3 judges seated beside him, as if hoping one of them will rescue him from this moment. But Clara only raises her eyebrows slightly, offering no help at all. The other 2 judges suddenly find something interesting to look at on their notepads. Gerald opens his mouth to argue, to find some clever excuse, some way to twist his earlier words into something less binding. But as he looks out across the hall, at 200 faces watching him, at a dozen phones aimed directly at his face, he realizes there is no version of this moment where he walks away without keeping his word. He thinks, briefly, about simply turning and walking out of the hall. His reputation, built over 15 years of running this academy, feels like it is balanced on a single decision, and every option in front of him seems to lead somewhere he does not want to go. Then his eyes fall on Elias, still sitting quietly at the piano bench, watching him without anger, without triumph, just watching. The way a boy watches an adult to see what kind of person he really is, underneath the expensive suit and the sharp words. Something about that look, calm and unguarded, makes the decision for him. Gerald Whitfield steps forward, away from the judges' table, into the open space in front of the piano where everyone can see him clearly. The hall falls silent again, a different kind of silence than before, thick with anticipation. He lowers himself to one knee. The sound of 200 phone cameras capturing the moment fills the hall like a wave of quiet clicks. Gerald stays there, on one knee, on the same floor where he laughed at a barefoot boy less than 10 minutes earlier, and for the first time in a very long time, he has absolutely nothing clever to say. Elias stands slowly from the piano bench. He walks toward Gerald, close enough that only the man kneeling in front of him can hear his next words clearly. "You don't have to stay down," Elias says quietly. "I just wanted to play." The simplicity of it, the complete absence of anger or revenge in a boy who had every reason to feel both, seems to hit Gerald harder than the kneeling itself. He looks up at the boy, and for a moment, something shifts visibly behind his eyes, something that looks almost like shame, mixed with the beginning of real respect. He rises to his feet slowly, brushing off his knee out of habit rather than necessity, and turns to face the crowd still watching him. Whatever he says next, he understands, will be remembered far longer than anything he has ever said before in this hall. But before he can speak, his phone buzzes in his pocket, then again, then a third time, rapid and insistent. He glances down without thinking, and sees the screen filling with notifications faster than he can read them, message after message, all mentioning the same thing. Somewhere outside this hall, in the 10 minutes since he knelt on that floor, the video has already begun to spread. Gerald stares at his phone, his thumb hovering over the growing list of messages, unable to decide which one to open first. A colleague from another academy has already sent a message asking if the video is real. A former student, someone he taught nearly a decade ago, has sent 3 exclamation points and nothing else. A reporter he vaguely remembers meeting at a fundraiser 2 years ago has sent a simple question: "Is this true, and can we talk?" He looks up from the screen, and the hall in front of him looks different than it did 15 minutes earlier, though nothing about the room itself has changed. The same chairs, the same worn piano, the same afternoon light coming through the tall windows. What has changed is him, and the way every single person in this room is now looking at him, waiting to see what kind of man he decides to be next. Clara steps quietly to his side, her earlier discomfort replaced now by something more thoughtful. "You should say something," she tells him, her voice low enough that only he can hear it, "before someone else decides what the story is for you." Gerald nods slowly, though his mind feels far away, still caught somewhere between the sound of that piano and the growing weight of his phone in his hand. He glances once more at Elias, who has returned to stand quietly near Margaret at the back of the hall, the two of them speaking softly to each other, seemingly unaware of the storm that has already begun to build outside these walls. Whatever happens next, Gerald understands, will not simply fade away by morning. The world outside this room has already started watching, and there will be no undoing what everyone in this hall witnessed today. By the next morning, the video is everywhere. It appears first on the account of the teenage boy who filmed it, a short clip barely 2 minutes long, showing Gerald's mocking words, Elias sitting down at the piano, and the final seconds where the director lowers himself to one knee. The caption reads simply, "Director mocks poor boy, then eats his words, watch till the end." By sunrise, it has been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By noon, the number climbs past 1 million. Comments flood in from every direction. Some people focus on Elias, few, calling him gifted, remarkable, a prodigy hiding in plain sight. Others focus entirely on Gerald, calling him cruel, embarrassed, exactly what he deserved. A few argue about whether the video was edited, whether it could possibly be real, until someone posts a second angle, filmed by a different parent from across the room, showing the exact same moment from another point of view. After that, the doubts mostly disappear. By early afternoon, local news stations have picked up the story. A young reporter named Daniel, working for one of the city's smaller stations, is the first to arrive at Ashcombe Music Academy, hoping to speak with Gerald directly. He finds the man in his office, staring at his own phone, surrounded by 3 assistants trying to draft some kind of official statement. "Mr. Whitfield," Daniel says, standing in the doorway, "would you be willing to talk on camera about what happened yesterday?" Gerald looks up, exhausted in a way that has nothing to do with sleep. He has not slept much, not with his phone buzzing through the night, not with the growing pile of messages from parents, from journalists, from people he has not spoken to in years, all wanting to know the same thing. "Is it true? Did you really say that? Did you really kneel?" "I'll talk," Gerald says finally, standing up and straightening his jacket out of old habit. "But I want the boy's side told too, properly, not just clips." Daniel nods, surprised by the request, having expected the director to want the opposite, some way to control the story and keep the focus off his own words. Instead, Gerald seems almost eager to shift attention elsewhere, as if talking about Elias might somehow soften what he said about him. The interview airs later that evening, shorter than Gerald had hoped, most of his careful words trimmed down to a single clip where he admits, plainly and without excuses, that he judged a child before hearing a single note. The clip spreads nearly as fast as the original video, though the reactions to it are mixed. Some viewers appreciate the honesty. Many others accuse him of only apologizing because he got caught on camera, arguing that a quieter version of the same cruelty happens in rooms like that every single day, simply without anyone recording it. Daniel, watching the reactions roll in from his desk at the station, cannot help but agree with parts of both arguments. He has covered enough stories over the years to know that public apologies rarely tell the whole truth of a person, and that real change, if it happens at all, usually happens far away from any camera. Still, something about the way Gerald asked him to focus on the boy's story instead of his own stays with him, enough that he decides to keep digging past the obvious angle everyone else is already chasing. And he starts making calls that same night, tracking down anyone connected to Elias's life before the video, hoping to understand the boy behind the moment that made him famous overnight. Across the city, at the small apartment Margaret and Elias share above a shuttered bakery, the phone in Margaret's kitchen has not stopped ringing since early morning. She does not recognize most of the numbers. She lets several calls go unanswered, unsure of what to say, uncertain whether any of this is good for her grandson, or simply another kind of danger dressed up as attention. Elias sits at the small kitchen table, eating breakfast quietly while his grandmother paces near the window, glancing down at the street below where, unbelievably, a small cluster of people has gathered outside their building. Some hold phones, clearly hoping to catch a glimpse of the boy from the video. One woman holds a handwritten sign that simply says, "We believe in you." "Grandma," Elias says quietly, watching her from the table. "Why are they all outside?" Margaret turns from the window, forcing a small smile onto her tired face, though worry sits heavy behind her eyes. "Because yesterday you played something beautiful," she tells him, "and it seems the whole world wants to hear it too." Elias considers this for a moment, his spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "I just wanted to play the piano," he says simply. "I didn't want any of this." Margaret crosses the small kitchen and kneels beside his chair, taking his hand gently in hers. "I know," she says, "and we are going to figure out together what to do with all of it. But whatever happens next, none of it changes who you are, or what that music means. Do you understand me?" Elias nods slowly, though the noise from outside their window, growing louder by the hour, makes it hard to feel as calm as his grandmother sounds. By that evening, 3 different news channels have run segments on the story. Each one shows the same clip, the same mocking words, the same stunned silence, the same slow kneel. But as the day goes on, reporters begin digging deeper, not satisfied with simply repeating the viral moment, hungry instead for the fuller story behind the boy at the piano. It does not take long for them to find it. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Priya who lives 2 doors down from Margaret and Elias, agrees to speak with a local reporter, describing the family with clear affection. She talks about how Elias's mother passed away 2 years earlier after a long illness, how Margaret took in her grandson without hesitation despite her own limited income, how the boy could often be heard humming quietly to himself on the stairwell, always some tune no one else recognized. Another report surfaces from a librarian at the public branch near their apartment, describing how Elias visited almost daily after school, using the library computers to watch free piano lessons online, sometimes staying until closing time, practicing silently on a paper printout of a keyboard he had drawn himself when the real computers were all in use. These details spread just as quickly as the original video, and the story shifts, slowly, from being about Gerald's humiliation to being about Elias's quiet, determined resilience. People who once shared the clip simply to laugh at a director eating his own words now share it again, this time with different captions, focused entirely on the boy who taught himself to play using nothing but borrowed devices and sheer will. Messages of support pour into every platform connected to the academy, and to the small news stations covering the story. Strangers offer to send money. Some offer piano lessons for free. A local furniture store offers to donate an actual piano to the family. An offer Margaret reads 3 times before showing it to Elias, unsure if it is real or some kind of trick. But along with the outpouring of kindness comes something heavier too, a kind of attention neither of them asked for or wanted. Photographers wait outside their building each morning. A few overly persistent reporters knock on their door directly, despite Margaret's repeated request for privacy. One afternoon, a stranger approaches Elias directly on his way home from school, phone raised, asking him to play something right there on the sidewalk for a video. Elias, startled and unsure how to respond, simply walks past without answering, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched against the unfamiliar weight of being recognized. At school the next day, the change is impossible to miss the moment Elias walks through the front doors. Children who never spoke to him before suddenly want to sit beside him at lunch. A group of older students, ones who usually ignore younger kids entirely, stop him in the hallway just to say they saw the video and thought it was amazing. His teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Farrow, pulls him aside quietly before class and tells him how proud she is, though her eyes look uncertain, as if she is not entirely sure how to treat a student who has suddenly become famous overnight. Not everyone reacts kindly. During lunch, a boy named Callum, who has never had much patience for Elias, leans across the table and asks, loud enough for others to hear, whether he practiced that fake sad look on purpose, whether the tears were part of the performance too. A few kids laugh. Elias says nothing, picking at his food quietly, the old, practiced calm settling over his face again, the same calm he wore in front of Gerald Whitfield and 200 strangers. But this time, someone else speaks up before he has to. A girl named Priscilla, who sits 2 seats away and has barely spoken to Elias before this week, turns to Callum with a sharp look. He lost his mom, she says flatly. Maybe try being human for once. The table goes quiet. Callum mutters something under his breath and looks away. And Elias, surprised by the unexpected defense, offers Priscilla a small, grateful nod that she returns without needing any further explanation. By the end of the school day, Elias feels more exhausted than he has in a long time, not from anything physical, but from the sheer effort of being watched so closely by so many eyes, all of them expecting something from him he is not entirely sure he can give. Walking home, he keeps his head down, grateful for once that the streets near the school are quieter than the ones near his apartment, where strangers still occasionally slow their cars just to look. That night, Margaret finds him sitting quietly on his bed, staring at nothing in particular. "Someone stopped me today," he tells her, his voice smaller than usual. "Wanted me to play for his phone, right there on the street." Margaret sits beside him, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. "And what did you do?" "I just walked away," Elias says. "I didn't know what else to do." "That was the right thing," Margaret tells him gently. "You don't owe anyone a performance just because they ask for one. Music is something you choose to give, not something people can take from you whenever they want it." Elias nods, though his eyes stay fixed on his hands, the same hands that, only a day earlier, had silenced an entire hall full of strangers. "Everyone keeps calling me gifted," he says quietly, "but I just miss her, that's all it ever was." Margaret pulls him close, holding him the way she has held him through every hard night since his mother passed, and for a long moment neither of them says anything at all, letting the quiet of their small apartment settle around them, a stark contrast to the noise still swirling outside their window. Meanwhile, across the city, Gerald Whitfield sits in his office long after everyone else has gone home, watching the same video for what must be the 20th time, hearing his own voice mock a child who had done nothing to deserve it. The Academy's phone lines have been ringing constantly, some calls from concerned parents questioning whether their own children are safe from similar treatment, others from journalists requesting comment, and a growing number from people simply calling to voice their anger directly at him. Clara finds him there well past dark, the office lit only by his computer screen. "The board wants a meeting first thing tomorrow," she tells him quietly, standing in the doorway much the way the reporter had stood in it that morning. "They're worried about the Academy's reputation." Gerald finally looks up from the screen, his face pale under the harsh office light. "And what about the boy?" he asks. "Does anyone care what happens to him after all of this dies down?" Clara studies him for a long moment, surprised by the question, by the genuine concern behind it. So different from the man who had mocked a child's shoes less than a day earlier. "That," she says slowly, "might depend entirely on you." Across town, Daniel spends most of the evening on the phone, piecing together the fuller picture of Elias's life, from teachers, neighbors, and the local librarian who lights up the moment his name is mentioned. She describes, in detail, how the boy would arrive at the library almost every afternoon, backpack heavier than seemed fair for someone his age, and settle into the same corner desk near the window, headphones on, eyes fixed on lesson videos he had watched so many times he could recite the instructor's words along with the recording. She tells Daniel about the day, nearly a year ago, when the library's small community piano, donated years earlier and rarely used, finally caught Elias's attention. He asked permission shyly before ever touching it, and once she said yes, He barely left it alone for the rest of that afternoon, staying so long past closing that she eventually had to walk him out herself, gently reminding him the doors needed to be locked. Daniel writes it all down, filling page after page of his notebook, and by the time he finally sets his pen down well past midnight, he realizes he no longer has a story about a director's embarrassing mistake. He has a much bigger story, one about a boy who built something extraordinary out of almost nothing, and a system that nearly let his talent go unseen simply because of how he looked walking through the door. He decides, right there at his desk, that tomorrow's piece will not focus on Gerald Whitfield at all. It will focus entirely on Elias, and on everything the boy had to overcome just to be given a single fair chance. What Daniel does not yet know, as he finally turns off his desk lamp for the night, is that his article, once published, will do far more than simply tell Elias's story. It will place a weight on Gerald Whitfield's shoulders heavier than any viral video ever could, forcing a decision the director has been quietly avoiding since the moment he rose from his knee in front of that crowded hall. Before any of that happens, though, Gerald has to face the Academy's board first, seated around the long table in the conference room he has walked into with confidence 100 times before. Today feels different. Today, 3 board members sit waiting for him with folders open, printed copies of the video's most damaging quotes highlighted in yellow. The Academy's reputation is at stake, says a man named Edmund, the board's oldest member, tapping his pen against the table. Donors are asking questions. Parents are asking questions. We need a plan, and we need it before the end of the week. Gerald sits at the head of the table, feeling the weight of 15 years of built reputation, pressing down on him more heavily than it ever has before. The plan, he says slowly, is for me to take full responsibility for what I said, publicly, and to make sure the boy at the center of this gets a fair, honest chance at the scholarship, tested properly, without any shortcuts either way. A woman named Charlotte, younger than the others, leans forward, and if the board decides that isn't enough, she asks, that the Academy needs a different kind of response, a resignation perhaps, to truly show accountability. The room goes quiet. Gerald has spent 15 years building this academy into what it is today. Recruiting talented teachers, expanding the scholarship program that first opened the door for students like Elias, defending the school's reputation through countless smaller controversies over the years. The idea of losing all of it in a single week, over 10 seconds of careless words, sits heavier on him than he expected. If that's what the board decides, he says finally, his voice steady despite the weight behind it, I'll accept it. But I'd ask for the chance to make this right first, in whatever way I still can, before that decision gets made. Edmund and Charlotte exchange a long look, and after a tense silence, Edmund finally nods. You have 2 weeks, he says. Handle this properly, Gerald. The whole city is watching how this ends. Gerald leaves the meeting with his job still intact, but only barely, the weight of the board's warning following him out into the hallway and staying with him for the rest of the day. Daniel's article appears online early the next morning, longer and more detailed than most of the quick clips and headlines that came before it. It tells the story of a boy who lost his mother at 10 years old, who taught himself piano using library computers and a cracked phone screen, who walked 3 miles to an audition because there was no money left for a bus fare that week. By midday, the article has been shared even more widely than the original video, and for the first time since this all began, the conversation online shifts almost entirely away from mockery and towards something closer to admiration and quiet reflection. Gerald reads the article twice at his desk that morning, and by the second reading, something in his chest feels heavier than it did the day before. He had assumed, somewhere in the back of his mind, that time would simply carry this story past him, that the attention would fade the way most viral moments eventually do. Daniel's article makes it clear that this story is not fading. If anything, it is only just beginning to be understood properly. He calls Clara into his office before the academy officially opens for the day. I want to offer him the scholarship personally, Gerald tells her, standing near the window overlooking the street below. Not through some form letter. I want to go there myself. Clara studies him carefully, arms crossed, clearly still uncertain how much of this sudden change to trust. And if his family says no, she asks. After everything that's happened, they'd have every reason to. Gerald turns from the window, and for the first time in a long while, his usual sharp confidence is nowhere to be found. Then I'll have to accept that too, he says quietly. But I have to try. I owe him that much. That afternoon, Gerald arrives at the small apartment above the shuttered bakery, dressed more plainly than usual. No expensive suit, no air of authority. Just a man, standing awkwardly outside a door he is not sure he has any right to knock on. Margaret answers after the second knock, her expression guarded the moment she recognizes his face from the video that has, by now, been viewed by nearly the entire city. "Mr. Whitfield," she says evenly. Not quite an invitation, not quite a dismissal either. "Mrs. Margaret," Gerald replies, his voice noticeably softer than the version of himself the world has been watching online for the past 2 days. "I know I have no right to be here uninvited. I just wanted to speak with you and Elias directly, if you'll allow it." Margaret studies him for a long moment, weighing the request against everything she has heard and seen this week, before finally stepping aside to let him in. The apartment is small but tidy, warmed by an old space heater in the corner, a few framed photographs on the wall, one clearly of a younger woman who shares Elias's same thoughtful eyes. Elias sits at the kitchen table, watching Gerald enter with a calm, unreadable expression that Gerald is beginning to recognize as simply who this boy is, steady even in moments that would rattle most adults twice his age. "I came to offer you the scholarship," Gerald says, sitting carefully in the chair Margaret gestures toward, properly this time. No cameras, no crowd, just an honest offer, because you earned it the moment you sat down at that piano. Margaret crosses her arms, standing near the counter rather than sitting. "And if we say yes," she asks carefully, "is it because you truly believe he deserves it? Or because half the city is watching to see what you'll do next?" The question lands exactly where she intended it to. Gerald is quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answers, his voice carries none of the polish he usually relies on in difficult conversations. "Both, if I'm honest," he admits. "The world is watching, yes, but that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because I heard something in that hall I haven't heard in a very long time, not in 15 years of running that academy, and I think I owe it to him, and to myself, to not let pride get in the way of recognizing real talent when it's finally standing right in front of me." Margaret's expression does not soften immediately, though something in her posture shifts slightly, less guarded than before. "You humiliated him," she says plainly, "in front of everyone, before you ever heard a single note." "I did," Gerald agrees, not looking away from her. "And there's no excuse I can offer that makes that right. I judged him the same way people judged me, a long time ago, before I became someone who thought he was above that kind of thing." Elias, who has been quietly listening from his seat at the table, finally speaks. "What do you mean?" he asks. "The same way people judged you." Gerald turns to him, and for a moment, the careful distance he usually keeps between himself and the families he auditions seems to disappear entirely. "I grew up without much either," he says quietly. "Smaller apartment than this one, actually. My father worked nights, and there was an old piano in the building's common room that nobody else wanted to touch. I taught myself on that piano, mostly at odd hours when no one was around to laugh at my mistakes. When I finally got the chance to audition for a real academy, years ago, the director there took one look at my shoes and told me not to bother sitting down." The room falls quiet. Margaret's arms slowly uncross. "I got in anyway," Gerald continues. "A different judge insisted on hearing me play, over that director's objections, and somewhere along the way, after years of climbing up through this world, I think I forgot what that moment felt like. I started believing the surface of things mattered more than it ever should have. Seeing your grandson sit down at that piano reminded me of exactly who I used to be before I let all of this." He gestures vaguely around himself, at his own expensive shoes, his own carefully built reputation. "Convince me that appearances tell the whole story." Elias studies him carefully, weighing the honesty in his voice against everything that happened 2 days earlier. "So you're not just doing this because people are watching," he says slowly, not quite a question. "I won't pretend the attention isn't part of it," Gerald says honestly. "But it isn't the reason. I want you at that academy because you have something rare, something I haven't heard in years of listening to children play. I don't want you to accept this offer because the world is watching me. I want you to accept it because you know, deep down, that it's real." Margaret finally sits down at the table across from him, studying his face carefully, searching for whatever remains of the man who mocked her grandson only 2 days earlier, and finding, to her surprise, someone who seems genuinely different, at least in this moment. "I won't have him treated as a charity case," she says firmly. "Not after everything the internet has already turned him into this week. If he takes this scholarship, it has to be because he earned it, not because you're trying to fix your own reputation." Gerald nods slowly, understanding settling over his features. "I agree completely," he says, "which is why I'd like to propose something different than simply handing it to him." Elias leans forward slightly, curious now despite himself. "What do you mean?" "A private audition," Gerald says. "No crowd, no cameras, none of the noise from this week following you into the room. Just you, the piano, and a panel of judges who will test you properly. On technique, on theory, on everything a real music student needs to know. Not just the one piece you played from memory. If you pass, the scholarship is yours, earned entirely on your own terms, with nothing owed to me or to anyone else. Elias considers this carefully, glancing briefly at his grandmother before answering. And if I don't pass, he asks, then we'll figure out another path forward, Gerald says honestly. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think you already know exactly how good you are. Margaret watches her grandson think it over, seeing in his careful, steady expression the same quiet determination she has watched him carry through 2 difficult years. Finally, Elias nods. Okay, he says simply. I'll take the test, properly, like you said. No cameras. Gerald extends his hand across the table, and after a brief pause, Elias shakes it, his small hand firm despite everything. Margaret watches the exchange with cautious hope, still unsure exactly what the coming weeks will bring, but sensing, for the first time since this whole whirlwind began, something that might actually be a fair chance rather than another performance for the world to watch. Before he leaves, Gerald pauses at the door, turning back toward the small kitchen. The audition will be in 10 days, he says. That should give you time to prepare, if you'd like it. I can arrange for a proper piano to be delivered here, so you're not practicing on a phone screen for something this important. Margaret starts to object, old pride rising automatically at the offer, but Elias speaks before she can. I'd like that, he says simply. I've never actually played a full song on a real piano before, not from start to finish, only that one time, at the audition. Something in his quiet honesty softens even Margaret's guarded expression. Gerald nods, promising the piano will arrive within the week, and lets himself out, leaving grandmother and grandson alone in the small apartment that suddenly feels, for the first time in a long while, full of something closer to hope than uncertainty. That night, after Elias has gone to bed, Margaret sits alone at the kitchen table, staring at the framed photograph of her daughter on the wall. She thinks about every hard choice of the last 2 years. Every night she came home too tired to speak, every sacrifice that felt, at the time, like it was barely holding their small world together. She thinks about the video, the mockery, the sudden fame, the strange, uncertain path that has led them here, to an offer that finally feels like it might be honest. You would have loved hearing him play, she whispers to the photograph, her voice barely above a breath. Properly, I mean. Not just through a wall. Outside, the city continues buzzing with the story that started in a crowded audition hall. But inside this small apartment, for the first time in days, there is only quiet, and the fragile, careful beginning of something that finally feels like it might turn out right. 10 days later, Elias stands outside a small practice room at the back of Ashcombe Music Academy, far away from the grand hall where everything began. There are no crowds here, no phones, no watching eyes beyond the 3 judges seated quietly at a table near the wall. Gerald stands off to the side, close enough to observe but far enough to make clear this is not his test to influence. The piano that had been delivered to Margaret's apartment a week earlier sits now only in Elias's memory, replaced today by an unfamiliar instrument, slightly different in touch and tone from the one he has spent the last 10 days learning to trust. He takes a slow breath before stepping inside, reminding himself of what Margaret told him that morning, over a breakfast neither of them had much appetite for. You don't have to prove anything to them, she said, tightening his collar unnecessarily, her hands needing something to do with their nervous energy. You already proved everything you needed to prove 10 days ago. Today is just you, showing them the rest. The judges begin with technical exercises, scales in every key, arpeggios that test not just skill but discipline, precise timing that leaves no room for the raw emotion Elias relied on during his first audition. He moves through them carefully, his ear catching every tiny imperfection before it becomes a real mistake, adjusting instantly the way a self-taught musician learns to, because there has never been a teacher standing over his shoulder to catch errors for him. Next comes sight reading, sheet music placed in front of him that he has never seen before, notes he must translate instantly into sound without any time to memorize or prepare. This is the part Gerald privately worried about most, knowing that a boy who taught himself entirely by ear might struggle with the formal language of written music that academy students spend years mastering. Elias studies the page for a long moment, his eyes moving carefully across the staff lines, before placing his hands on the keys. The first few notes come slower than his usual playing, careful and deliberate, but as he settles into the rhythm of the unfamiliar piece, his confidence grows, each phrase flowing more naturally into the next. It becomes clear, watching him, that whatever gaps exist in his formal training, His ear and his instinct fill them in almost seamlessly. Finally, the judges ask him to play something of his own choosing. One last piece to close the audition. Elias does not hesitate. He plays the same composition from 10 days earlier, though this time, without the noise of a crowded hall around him, without the weight of 200 watching strangers. The music sounds even more intimate, each note given full space to breathe in the quiet room. When he finishes, the youngest of the three judges, a woman with sharp eyes and a notepad full of careful marks, sets down her pen and looks toward her colleagues. None of them say anything at first, exchanging a series of small nods that speak more clearly than words ever could. "Congratulations," she finally says, turning to Elias with the first real smile he has seen from any of them all morning. "You're in." Outside the practice room, Margaret has been waiting on a small bench in the hallway, her hands folded tightly the same way they were folded at the back of that crowded hall 10 days earlier. When Elias steps out, his expression unreadable for a brief moment before breaking into a wide, genuine smile. She does not need him to say a single word. She simply stands and pulls him into a tight embrace, right there in the hallway, neither of them caring who might be watching. Gerald watches from a respectful distance, something easing visibly in his own shoulders, a tension he has carried since the moment he first lowered himself to one knee finally beginning to lift. The following weeks bring changes neither Margaret nor Elias could have fully predicted. Elias begins formal lessons at the academy, working alongside teachers who quickly recognize what the judges recognized that day, adjusting their usual methods to nurture, rather than restrict, the raw instinct that already lives inside him. Gerald, true to his word, becomes something more than simply the man who runs the academy. He begins personally mentoring Elias, sitting in on lessons occasionally, offering guidance shaped by his own long-forgotten memory of what it felt like to learn piano on an instrument nobody else wanted. The academy's board, watching the story unfold in the following months, one that shifts steadily from controversy toward genuine redemption, decides against asking for Gerald's resignation. Instead, at Gerald's own suggestion, the academy launches a new scholarship fund, one specifically designed for students from families who could never otherwise afford proper lessons, named quietly, without much fanfare, simply the Second Chance Fund. Gerald insists that his own name stay off the program entirely, telling the board plainly that the fund should be about the students it helps, not about repairing his own reputation. Margaret, for her part, finally allows herself to accept a small amount of help, agreeing to fewer cleaning shifts each week once Elias's scholarship covers tuition and equipment costs, giving her more evenings to sit with him while he practices on the piano that now sits permanently in the corner of their small living room, a gift Gerald insisted on making permanent rather than temporary. The Second Chance Fund, quiet as its launch had been, grows steadily over the following years. Within its first year, it awards places to 3 more students who might otherwise have been turned away, for reasons that had nothing to do with their talent. A girl who taught herself violin using her uncle's old, cracked instrument, a boy who learned percussion by tapping rhythms on overturned buckets outside his apartment building, another whose family had fled hardship overseas and arrived with nothing but a deep, quiet love of singing. None of their stories go viral. None of them are discovered through a moment of public mockery caught on camera. They are simply given a fair chance, quietly, the way Elias always believed he should have been given one from the very beginning. Gerald visits each new student personally before their first lesson, a habit he begins the year after Elias's private audition and never once abandons. He tells them, plainly, without dramatics, that talent does not announce itself through the clothes someone wears or the manner in which they walk into a room, and that he learned this lesson the hard way, in front of an audience of 200 people, who will likely never let him forget it. Most of the students laugh nervously at this admission, not quite believing that the composed, well-dressed director standing in front of them was ever the subject of a viral video mocking his own arrogance. A few ask to see it. Gerald always says the same thing in response, that some lessons are worth revisiting, even the embarrassing ones, especially the embarrassing ones. Elias, meanwhile, becomes something of a quiet mentor himself as he grows older, occasionally sitting in on lessons with the fund's youngest students, offering the kind of patient, practical advice that only comes from someone who once sat exactly where they are sitting now, uncertain and unsure whether the world had any real place for someone like them. He never speaks much about the video itself, uninterested in reliving a moment that, to him, has always mattered far less than the years of quiet practice that came both before and after it. Years pass, quietly and steadily, filled with practice, lessons, small local performances, and the slow, patient growth of a talent that started in the corner of a public library, headphones pressed against a boy's ears. Elias grows taller, his voice deepens slightly, but the calm, steady presence he carried into that first audition never fully leaves him, even as his skill grows into something that draws attention from far beyond the walls of Ashcombe Music Academy. 5 years after that first audition, a concert hall downtown, far larger and grander than the modest hall where this story began, fills with an audience of several hundred people. Tonight is Elias's graduation recital, the final performance before he leaves the academy for a conservatory across the country. A scholarship there already secured months earlier, built entirely on his own growing reputation, rather than any lingering trace of the viral moment that first introduced him to the world. Backstage, 17-year-old Elias adjusts his jacket in a small mirror, Margaret standing beside him, her hair now more gray than it was 5 years earlier, her eyes shining with a pride she no longer bothers to hide. "Nervous?" she asks, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from his shoulder, the way she has before every performance since that first audition. "A little," Elias admits, managing a small smile, "but a good kind of nervous." From the doorway, a familiar voice speaks up. The good kind is the only kind worth having. Gerald stands there, older now too, his sharp suits replaced by something slightly softer over the years, though his presence still carries the same quiet authority it always has. He has watched Elias grow from a boy mocked for his shoes into a young man about to walk onto one of the city's largest stages, and the journey has changed him nearly as much as it changed Elias himself. "Thank you for everything," Elias says simply, the same simple honesty he carried into that very first conversation in Margaret's kitchen 5 years earlier. "None of this happens without you deciding to actually listen that day." Gerald shakes his head slightly. "None of this happens without you deciding to sit down and play anyway," he corrects gently. "Even after everything I said to try and stop you." The stage manager calls a 5-minute warning, and Margaret squeezes her grandson's hand one final time before stepping away toward the audience, finding her seat in the third row, exactly where she has sat for every recital these past 5 years. When Elias finally walks out onto the stage, the applause that greets him is warm and genuine, filled with people who have followed his progress for years now, not because of a viral video from his childhood, but because of the steady, remarkable talent he has built since. He sits at the grand piano, far larger and finer than the small worn instrument from his first audition, and for a moment, he simply lets his hands rest on the keys, breathing in the quiet anticipation of the hall. He begins with the same composition that started everything, the piece he wrote as a grieving 10-year-old, though tonight it sounds different, richer, shaped by 5 years of formal training layered gently over the raw emotion that first gave it life. The melody unfolds across the silent hall exactly as it did that day, rising, storming, softening, until it settles finally into the same peaceful ending that once left an entire room of strangers in stunned silence. As the final note fades, the audience rises immediately to their feet, applause thundering through the hall. Elias stands and bows, his eyes scanning the crowd until they find Margaret in the third row, her hands pressed together, tears streaming freely down her face this time, no longer hidden the way they were during that very first performance. Near the back of the hall, standing rather than seated, Gerald claps louder than anyone else around him, his applause carrying none of the mockery it once did, replaced entirely by something that looks, unmistakably, like pride. Elias catches his eye across the crowded hall and offers a small, private nod, one that needs no words to explain everything it carries between them, the mockery that started this journey, the honest reckoning that followed it, and the 5 years of quiet, patient growth that turned a moment of public humiliation into the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted that ordinary afternoon in a crowded audition hall. The applause continues, warm and unending, filling the hall long after Elias has taken his final bow. A sound built not from a single viral moment, but from years of dedication that no camera ever needed to capture for it to be real.